Thanks to the hard work of Kathy Durkin, our Director of Questions, for making today happen. I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce our world-traveling artist and author. So, Kathy, here's to you.
Thank you. And as my students know, I've been a Hazel fangirl for years. In fact, everybody who comes into my class gets one of these 10-minute watercolors. That's my current stash. Hazel is a British artist working out of studios in London and Cape Town and on location around the world. She paints in watercolor and oil, is particularly known for her direct wet into wet watercolor approach and her use of rich pigments and strong contrasts of light and shade. Shape, interval, and tone are her predominant subject matter. Figures, African wildlife, and action are her main source of reference. Her work is represented in private and public collections worldwide. She's also a natural and talented communicator. She became popular for a TV role as an art expert on British Channel 4's Watercolor Challenge and her own series, Angela TV's Splash of Color. Her passion for painting is shared through books, which Roberta showed some, and I bought the one that's coming out on Tuesday on Amazon, advanced order. There you go, little commercial. Books, DVDs, if you still have a DVD player, workshops, lectures, and painting holidays, demonstrating the vibrant immediacy of the watercolor medium and properties of pigments. And he's a regular author of more than 20 books and contributes regularly to our articles in the Artist magazine, which even though it's a British magazine, you can get shipped to you here in the US because I have a subscription. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Hazel.
Hello, pleased to meet you all, even if it's virtually. I'm thrilled to be able to do this demo and to be doing the workshop in what is about a month's time. Those of you who know my work know that I do have this passion for watercolor. I absolutely love the medium, and I love the pigments, I love the water, I love the paper, I love everything about it. And I love the fact that it is such a direct medium and that the brush you're so connected between the brush, the paint, and the paper. And the wet into wet technique I have found to be the most direct way that I can quickly get something down on paper. And I do love to paint from life if possible, because by painting, basically what happens with watercolor pigments is that the first layer is the most transparent. Your paper, I'm sure you all know this already, but your paper is the light. And so when you lay your films of watercolor over the paper, that first layer is by default going to be the most transparent. So the beauty of the wet into wet medium is that in so far as I can, in as much as I possibly can, in that first layer, I like to get as much information in, because all that is then happening in the first layer and maximizing the transparency. So without further ado, we'll go straight into painting. I'm going to start with something more simple than a figure. I'm going to start with this rose, just to show you the most important thing about the wet into wet technique is that the water is on the paper already in the previous wash, and therefore every subsequent touch of color needs to be drier than the one before to take into account that there is already water on the paper. So that's this rose will be the perfect way for us to start. I'll go to my webcam. And this, in the workshop, I'll be going into all these things in more detail. But basically, every color in your palette has different properties. And the reason that they are all in all the artist brands is because they have different properties. There is nothing that replicates another color. That's what's so extraordinary and why we're all completely sucked into buying more and more colors. But ultimately, if you're going to paint outside, you have to have you have to create a palette that allows you to paint everything that you see, but is limited to what you can carry around in your palette. And this is my palette. And you will see that the colors that appear very dark on the screen are in general the transparent colors. And the colors that appear lighter are the opaque colors. So within your palette, immediately is the information as to how deep and dark your color can go. So say we're painting this rose, and I'm going to use it. I use predominantly schmink colors, but their ruby red is what other companies call permanent rose, which is quinacridone red rose. And so this is this color here, and you can see that it is not, it's not as dark as, say, something like alizarin crimson, which is so dark you can barely see that it's crimson there. But it dilutes into something very, very pale and will go as dark as that, which might just reach the depths of this rose. If not, then we have to pick up the alizarin crimson to make the darker color. But let's try. So first of all, with wet into wet, you go for the very palest color first of all. So here, the very, very pale leaves, petals, not leaves, on the left-hand side, our palest color. And I'll just try and create a bit oversized rose so that it's got a bit more space on the paper and on the screen. And we're leaving out the areas of real light, so the areas of white, because those are the areas that give us our contrast. They are the white paper acting as the lightest highlights in the painting. And it always behoves you to leave areas of white, obviously not if there aren't any, but if there are, because you can always come back and tint them. But once they're gone, they're gone. It's very, very difficult to get back white paper. There are some colors that are less staining than others. So even though watercolor is a staining medium, there are colors that do lift. And we'll be talking about those a lot during the course of the program in June. So my overall shape of my petals is created with a single layer, and then gradually I increase the amount of pigment and drop it into the already wet watercolor. Now on this side, on the right-hand side, the rose is darker than on the left-hand side.
Hazel,
So,
we do have one question. Someone wanted to know if your paper was wet to start with.
no, my paper is dry because I want crisp edges to the petals. And a wetness on the paper means you will get softness. So you only wet paper when you want a soft edge. And you can see very clearly in this as the colors building up that where I've left some white, we get a little hard edge, and where I've got paint is a soft edge. And already you can see the rose forming just simply with those two simple washes. And now we're going to go in with deeper color. Unless I'm painting a sort of sky wash, I very rarely wet all the paper ahead of time, because I'm probably going to want some areas of crisp white paper. If I'm trying to get a seamless wash right across the paper, then I will wet the paper. But otherwise, I tend not to beforehand.
And we have another question, Hazel. They wanted to know, I see that you did not have a drawing on this paper, but you usually sketch out your work, or do you always go freehand?
No, I do as much as I can without sketching, because I find that pencil can limit what you paint. Now, obviously, something like this is possible without sketching, but there are other things like the figure we'll do in a minute, which does need to be sketched because there's much more information and more detail that needs to be avoided. So basically, something like this, it is possible to do without a pre-sketch. Other things, not so. But I find sometimes pencil can limit. It also is a tone of its own, so it's going to slightly contaminate some of the really pale washes. I love pencil marks, so I'm not anti-pencil in any way. It's just that every single mark you put on the paper matters. And watercolor is a medium of minimums. Less is more in watercolor. So the least times you touch that paper, even if it be pencil, rubber, whatever it is, the more likely you are to get success. And you see, I'm just touching in. I'm not following completely the actual, here's my reference. It's not, I'm not doing an exact reference, but I'm being guided by it. And you see how quickly we can build up what is effectively quite a complicated subject, but because the grading is all being done by the paint seeping, what's the word? Diffusing into the in the washes that are already there. All the work is done for me, and I can create what is effectively quite a complex flower, but very quickly. Now that's about as deep as I can get my ruby red. Look, I'm going as dry. That is dry paint. Okay, that's dry. So I can't really go much deeper. Look, if I put that in there, it's more, oh, it can do a little bit, can't it? But it's more or less the same tone that's already in there. So if I want there to be any deeper color, then I would have to go up one more tone and pick another color such as alizarin to do that. So if we want to make that center darker, go into the alizarin crimson. We don't have to, but we want to. Now, the other thing with wet in wet is you notice I'm using the same size brush all the time. And to start with, I filled the whole body of the brush. Gradually, I've been just concentrating in the tip, because obviously, if you don't want too much water in your subsequent washes, then you need to keep water out of the body so that it can't run down into the tip of the brush and give you too much water and too much, you'll be out of control. When you get too much water is when you get the blooms. So the cauliflowers, which are lovely in their own place, but obviously when you don't want them, then that's why you're getting them. And then if we wanted to go even darker still, and I don't particularly need to, I would go up with a bit of violet. We'll just do that just to show that here we can come right into the very centers of this rose if we really wanted to, just by going deeper up through our reds effectively. And then we'll just give ourselves a wash around this shape because we've left out the highlights at the side. And I'm going to use Prussian blue. Oh, where's my Prussian? And a little bit of, I think a little bit of Indian yellow to bring a nice bit of color around this to create the shape of this rose. Bring it round, bring it under. Round the top of here, round here. Bring out the highlights, the top. And varying these two. I often just use a red, a yellow, and a blue. I very rarely make my greens with a ready-made green because I'm always trying to use the minimum number of colors. And in most subjects, there is the 3 primary colors at some point. In almost every subject, there is blue. It's very rare for there not to be a blue in a painting because shadow, obviously, even white in shadow is blue. And in every painting, there is usually some yellow in every incident. Not always reds. The red can be, browns or violets, crimsons. But I find that one way of creating a minimum palette is if my colors are guided by the 3 primaries, then I already by default have the chance for a minimum palette, because red, yellow, and blue obviously make all the colors. But it's making the combinations that counts. It's choosing different combinations that work. And then I'm now coming to a size 8. I want to pick up more color because I want to come in and be nice and neat and dark to bring out the edge of the rose. There's a nice leaf here. Let me show you this reference again so you can see what we're doing. I'm just roughly using that reference. The nice thing about painting flowers is that doesn't matter what you paint, at some point they will have looked like it in some way. And they always disappear so that no one could ever say you're wrong. Leave out some nice bits. And the beauty is just going into the wet wash does a lot of the work for me. It makes, I can suggest that there's leaves, that there's detail in the leaves even. A lot of it is suggestion. Watercolor is a powerful medium of suggestion. Again, it's that less is more thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And Hazel, did you pre-wet your palette, the paints in your palette?
No, I only ever wet the colors I'm using, because one of the things I have learned, well, paint is expensive, as we all know. And basically, when you wet your colors, you begin to be leaching out the gum arabic that binds those colors together. So if you wet colors that you are not using, you are effectively just wasting paint, because basically as it dries, the evaporates out, some of the paint will look sunk down the bottom. And you'll probably find if you've got old pans, you'll see how they sort of shrink in on themselves and go, you know, they sort of go, what's the word? I'm covering some of mine up, but my cobalt blue there had sort of shrunk in on itself. So I squeezed some more out. But basically, I only wet the colors I'm using, because that's the only time you need to wet your colors, is when you actually need that paint. Now I completely forgot about the stem here that's coming out here, but we're not really. I was more trying to show you the wet in wet of the rose. Now the other thing I like to do is I like there to be a little bit of what's the word? Ambiguity into the foliage with the flower. So in other words, I let some of that color run into the rose, just so that we're not getting just an outline, but so that the rose and its background have some kind of symbiotic link, so that there's life. Because the thing about watercolor is that it is the one medium that can create organic life beyond the painting. And I think it's that I'm always trying to get. I'm always trying to get the feeling that there's more happening than actually I have ever painted, that there's life, not just liveliness, but lifeliness. That's the word I like to use. And I think probably that does for that demonstration. So now, any questions about that before we go on to something else?
Yes, there was one question. They wanted to know what kind of paper you were using.
Oh, right. That's a very good point. And I should have mentioned that. Yes, I'm using Saunders Waterford paper. And for this one, I'm using a rough surface. Here, by the way, I'm just showing you that you can also use water to just push shapes outwards as well with this wet in wet technique. So you don't have to just be using paint. You can also use water. And every time you add color, it's going to go outwards. So if I add color here, it will go out into the wash. So that's one of the things to remember, that when whichever color you want to be dominant, you use that last, because that's the one that's going to go out into the wash. What else did I need to tell you about the paper? I said it was rough surface, it's Saunders Waterford. Yeah, that's about it. And the size I'm working here, you can probably guess, is this looks a little bit four-petaled here, doesn't it? I think we need to change this shape a little bit. The size is about 15 by 15, which is about as high as I can get my webcam to come above the above the picture.
Right. Okay.
Right. So if there's no more questions on that, then I will go on with my next demonstration.
Okay, that looks like all the questions on this one.
Brilliant. Okay. Right, next we're going to do a figure because we're going to see how quickly we can create a figure with this method. So here is my reference. We're just doing this lady here because we haven't got time to do more than one figure. And you can see it looks very complicated. How on earth can you do something like that quickly? But the wet into wet enables us to do so. She's a bit longer than I can fit her on the screen. I can see that. So we may have to just go off the bottom here. Shall I leave the reference there? Yes, that's a good idea, isn't it? Yeah. Right. First of all, I'm going to get rid of that green. I'm very, very picky about clean water. Because I travel a lot and I can't carry huge amounts of water, I use much smaller containers than this if I'm not in the studio, if I'm going to be short on water, because I always want to know that I've definitely got clean water for my washes. And that is one of my sort of sticklers that I follow. And I think I didn't rinse out that brush. This is the problem with demoing, is that you're never quite as disciplined as you are when you're painting for real life. Let's make sure those should have all been cleaned out first. And I use a lot of kitchen towel. You can probably see already that the kitchen towel is covered in permanent rose because I'm always taking the paint off my brush to be able to get the right consistency in it. So we'll start with these bananas at the top. And in my palette, my two yellows are Aureolin and Indian yellow, and they are slightly opaque, and the reason you can know that is because you can see the color. If they were really transparent yellows like quinacridone yellow or transparent yellow, then they would be looking like a brown, but you can tell that they're slightly opaque just simply by the fact that their actual hue can be very clearly seen in the palette. We don't really have any pink in here, so we'll take this off the palette as well. I also use the tilt of the palette a lot because this side of my palette, not clear to see really on the screen, but this is sloping downward and this side of the palette is flat. And you can see there that the water is gathering in the pool, the meniscus of the water there. So this is the color that I will be laying. You often find, and certainly watercolor dries lighter on the paper, wet watercolor looks darker. But often it's because you think that's the color that you're laying, but in fact, that's the color you're laying. So using the slope of your palette is a very sensible way of making sure that you don't have, that you have enough pigment in your wash for the layer or wash that you're doing. So here we can use, again, the wet in wet to quickly make our bananas. We know that's wet. Let's come in with drier color. We're first of all just looking at the overall. As we did with the rose, we find the general overall tone. So the light is from this side going across. So this side of the bananas is definitely going to be darker than the other side, and these fruits on top, which look like mangoes to me. And at the moment, I'm just basically tinting with the wet and wet watercolor the undersides of those items, and then go with a much smaller brush, because now I really want to be able to get in with detail. And because it's not a transparent yellow, I can't go darker than that. So that's not going to satisfy the darkness of my bananas. So I'm going to pick up raw sienna. This is raw sienna here, and use that as my dark yellow. And look how dry that is, not very wet. And use that to be my shadowy areas in between the bananas so that I can hint at them. Bear in mind, we're trying to paint this quickly because we are assuming she's going to walk off. My whole, I think my whole way of painting has come out of painting in Africa more than anything else, because being a hot country, things dry quickly, so you need to have a wet technique. And I think also using the rough paper. Now, just for the very darkness, I've picked up the opposite color to yellow, which is violet. This is my violet in here. And you see it's very transparent. You can hardly see it, it's very black. And I've mixed it with the yellow on my brush, which is why it looks brown. And that's going to be my darks in between. And I'm just looking at some of them so that I can itemize these bananas. Not all of them. The beauty of the wet in wet technique is that it does all the work for you of the grading between things. So we're just looking at the very darkest areas so that we have very quickly created the feeling of a whole pile of fruit on her top of her basket. And now we'll do something similar with the blue, but the blue doesn't need the same kind of detail. This is probably more a cobalt blue. And in this instance, we don't want wet in wet because the shadow is hard. This shadow here across the bucket is a hard shadow. And so it behoves us to let this blue dry because we can't get a crisp shadow from a wet edge. Actually, I think I'm going to go with ultramarine so I get a brighter blue because it looks a little bit pale on there. And this can come down through the shadow into her head and her dark hair, because blue is a composite of a component, I should say, not a composite, a component of most shadow. So it will help bring that shadow round. And as that's a hard shadow, we can let that shadow dry and get that painted at the same time.
And Hazel, we have a question. Someone wants to know what kind of brushes you use most frequently.
Most frequently or always?
Well, they said, yeah, okay, always.
Yes, because it could be different sizes. Basically, I use natural hair brushes. So these are actually sable. But what I like about the hair brush is that the natural barbs of hair hold the water so that only when I press down is the water released. And so I have complete control over every mark I make. So if I load this brush with paint and then hold it up like that, it's not going to drop out because I have to release it to make it drop out. And if you use nylon brushes, which have lovely shapes, and I have nothing against nylon brushes, but the problem is the filaments don't have any barbs. And so you have to be very, very careful that you don't overfill them with water, because otherwise they can drop down by gravity onto areas where you don't really want them to be. And I tend to paint flat because I paint very wet in wet. It's not such a problem if you're going to paint upright, but if you're painting flat, then gravity's not your friend if you don't want that water to be there. Now here, I've got some quite crisp shadows. So again, I can use the fact that this blue is a useful color in shadow and bring that around just to be the beginning of her white shirt there, a white cardigan. So the sizes of the brushes I use tend to be large rather than too small. This is a size 8. My flat brush is a 19mm, and this bigger brush I was using before was a 10, and then I also have a 12 and a 14 in my brushes, which are to the side of me here. I do use small brushes sometimes, as you saw just now with the banana detail, but not frequently, not frequently. Now this blue can also come down and be the lighter color of her skirt. So the first color I'm laying is, and it can also be this lovely little blue painted basket here. Don't know whether it is so lovely. It might just be a plastic basket, but it looks like a little basket. So the first layer is always the lightest color. And here the color of her skirt is kind of pale. Now, what I am going to do, and what I often do with wet in wet, let me just push this up a bit, is I will wet the paper to the side of where the wash is going, not where the wash is, but to the side of it so that it would meet it, so that my paint can go into that wash and give myself a soft edge. So often I do wet the paper, but only where I want something to kick out and be a soft edge. Keep this light because we want to come in darker with the shadows in the blue. And always it's about trying to get the most done with the least amount of, I don't want to say least amount of effort, but it is the least amount of it, least amount of brushworks, least amount of touching it. Oh, you can't see the bottom, but I'd have just on the feet down there. Now we're going for the deeper colors in this skirt. So I'm going on my slope, letting my water run out of my brush because it's far too wet. Getting my color deeper so I can find these lovely deep creases in the fabric. A lot of wet in wet is trusting the watercolor to run in the right direction, in the right way that you want it to at the right time. And it doesn't always do that, but because it is this, in this single layer, there is a yumminess about the watercolor because it's so fresh and so clean. So it doesn't have to always work and always be right for it to work. I mean, that's what's so exciting about it, is that it kind of does the work for you. So you don't actually have to have it so perfect, because of the nature that watercolor will just do it for you. And there's a nice, let's come over to the dry color, nice tone down the side of this little sort of buckety, whatever it is exactly, I'm not quite sure. And then now I want to make her top slightly, her top's got lovely colors in, and so here I am going to wet her top so that I can get these colors to blend slightly together. Pick up a bit of my yellow. Quite bright in this little bit of the tie bit here, and then there's a little bit of pink. Pick up a tiny bit of this pink over here that we used earlier. And let it softly blend underneath there. And then there's even a little bit of green. I've got some green over here because this is phthalo green. The only green I have in the palette is sap green. And I don't I very rarely have, as I say, ready-made greens. But I happened to be using some phthalo green the other day, so it's there. Take advantage of it. And then there's some blues in there. And now we can start to use that blue to be the shadow in the costume. And then that lovely crease that runs across wet into wet. I want to get it wet into wet because then it gives us that movement of the as she goes across, as she's swinging her body across. And we'll take that into the jacket so that it feels like it all belongs together. On this side, there's hardly any light on this jacket, hardly any shadow, sorry, I should say. Hardly any shadow, but it must come, something must come down there. And then we can use the outside of here to bring out these lights. And maybe put a bit of that green in there, seeing as that can work with her costume as well. Let's come back up to the face, and we can use this brown. I like to keep to minimum colors, so we've already got the violet and the raw sienna, and they're perfect for her skin tone. So we'll use that color, and we'll leave the light out on her lid side. Put a little bit of warmth in there from the colors we've got already. We've already got plenty of colors in this painting, so we can use colors that we already have. We don't need to introduce any new colors.
Hazel, this is just so exciting to watch, and we just had someone sign up for your workshop. So all of y'all that are watching this, you can get more detailed information during the workshop. So
yeah, the workshop,
while we're spaced there.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time during the workshop to do things and to really talk about how these, how to really make this wet in wet work for you, because obviously I'm demonstrating in this one, then we'll be painting along with me, and we'll be concentrating on really getting the quantities of paint and water, because I mean the one thing, basically evaporation rates you can never guess, and so there's never a time you could never say, oh, 17,000 pigment particles to 1 drop of water or whatever, because it's different every single time. So it's really only practice that enables you to really work out these wet in wet quantities, water to pigment. Right, we're going in for the hair now, and we'll use the violet-y color that we made with violet and the raw sienna, and the blue that we've got to make the black for the hair. And black for the eyes and little brows. And let that then, now the underside of the I don't know what you call it, a bowl. It's a bowl, isn't it? Not a bucket. The underside of the bucket, the bowl, is, you can just see it. You can just see it It's not very clear in the picture, but she's just tilted slightly that way. So we can push that hair into the shadow of the bowl and darken up down the side of the face, under the ear. Let's put a little bit of warmth into her lips. Need quite a small brush for this. This is the size 6. A little bit here for the dimple in the chin. A little bit dimple under the oh, I don't think we needed that tone on there. The face looks a bit let's try and get this color here and bring that around there. Give her that ear there. And then the lovely shadow on the bowl at the top there. I do love that, the bananas that are hanging down. And I think this is dry now. Let's just see. Yes, this is dry. So the bananas that are hanging down are casting this nice shadow across. And then we'll bring that. There's a lovely reflected light. Or no, I think it might be a cloth or something. Sometimes with photographs, you've got some really weird things going on and you have to just kind of guess what's going on here. The arm here, we need a bit of darkness for this. Around here, so we come back, get ourselves a bit of clean. Let's use the yellow and the violet to get a brown, a clean brown. Get her hand up here and try and let that merge with that so that we can come under those bananas and give ourselves a little bit of increased shadow on that side. And then down on her hand. And we're just going to hint at the fingers coming across. And we can't really, if we come down to the feet, like them not to be on the under the lit portion of her sarong. We'll have a nice crisp shadow, but we want in the shadow, the ambiguity of the shadow, we'll turn that to blending wet in wet so that it has much more ambiguity. As a rule of thumb, I find that there is definition in the lights and ambiguity in the shadows, and so I tend to try and make my shadowy areas very ambiguous, and then let my lit areas have detail. And I think that that's really all I want to do on that, to just show how quickly we can make, people are complicated, and yet by using the wet into wet, we can very quickly create a figure moving, and we've got a lovely flow to the skirt, we've got 3-dimension, and basically we have a figure, and we have bananas even as well. And then my last demonstration is going to be an elephant, because, as you heard, my studios are both in Cape Town and in London. So I figured we need to have an elephant to complete our set of paintings for this But the whole intent is to master this wet into wet, which gives such a lovely freshness and enables you to paint outside quickly, and enables you to make watercolors quickly, and gives you the most beautiful appearance. But also to learn about the properties of the watercolors, because it's the properties. If you know your properties, you know what you can use and when, you know which ones can lift and therefore are safe, which ones stain and are therefore not safe. So it'll be lots and lots of information about this wonderful medium. Now, sorry, does that answer the question or not really?
Actually, it did answer the question, because what it told us is that you're such a great instructor. You're taking extra special time to make sure we get the best. So thank you.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, I've never was trained to teach, but I love what I do and I love passing it on. And I have learned, I suppose in the early days, I was quite protective of my reference, because obviously, you know, your photographs are your copyright and everything, but I was loath to sort of use some of the best things that then became paintings, because I thought, well, you know, there's going to be copies all over the place. But then I realized that, you know, everybody paints differently, and it's, you know, they're used in the workshops anyway. It's not that they're used beyond the workshops. And it's freed me up to be able to, you know, really choose things that really make for good workshop material. So hope those who come along will enjoy it. Now here I am using yellow ochre, which is one of my go-to colors in Africa, to basically start the shape of the elephant. If I paint smaller than this, then I tend to go straight in, just like I did with the rose, without any drawing. You'll notice that these are that this is a sideways on elephant, because a sideways on elephant you can paint directly. If the elephant's coming towards you, it's almost impossible to do that without drawing, because of the foreshortening and because there's things in front of things. In other words, there's the heads in front of the back. But the profile of animals, because that is their sort of go-to shape, those you can, I do, you know, when I'm taking people into the bush to paint, we just paint direct. We don't, you know, we don't draw first. And
Hazel, one of our students, one of our members wants to know, why are you using yellow and not making grays?
Well, I haven't yet added any other color, so there's because sorry, I see what you're saying. Yes, basically, gray is a color made from all the colors, isn't it? As is black, and I always build my colors from the constituent colors that I see in them, and I don't, you know, I see this elephant, I can see he's gray, but to me he doesn't look gray. I see blues, I see violets. Let me show you the reference again. You know, yes, I suppose he looks gray, but to me I see all sorts of colors in there. And because I know that blue, red and yellow make gray, any combination of that I can use to paint this elephant. And so I've started with my lightest hue, which is the yellow ochre, which works for the landscape. And as there is some light to be held back from the top of his head here, it was good to put the yellow ochre in first. And I always would put the lightest color first, not just because watercolors are built up from light to dark, but also because for water, basically that means I've got, my chances are that I'll keep my water clean enough for the whole duration of the painting. So now I'm bringing in the blue, which I see, which is effectively the shadows and the lights, the cool lights. So the yellow, I suppose you could say, is the warm lights, and the blue is the cool lights. But it's not quite as simple as that, because also they're both constituents of the grey. So I'm using a size 10, and my brush marks are quite broad and trying not to be too, what's the word, too edgy, because it's going to get darker as the colours blend and become the colourful constituents of a grey. And I don't want there to be too many repeat, what I call watercolour edges repeat. So I'm trying to keep my brush lively, trying to keep the strokes big and not be too accurate, if that makes sense. Accurate's probably the wrong word, but and I think you can, I'm sort of stroking the strokes across rather than brushing, but stroking the strokes and enhancing the, I'm wanting to keep the whole elephant wet so that the colours can blend on the paper. And thankfully it's not quite as hot as in Africa here. So it's got every chance. And where that elephant is kicking up dust, I want there to be a nice blending of the dust with the feet at the bottom. So keeping that wet. And always, I think, one thing, when you're working wet in wet, you have to be aware of your what's dry and what's wet in your painting as you're going round. So it makes you continually not think of an elephant's ears, trunk, whatever it is. It makes you always think of the whole rather than the parts. And I think that's really important in watercolor, that one is aware that one is painting a watercolor and we're not painting, you know, although the ear is basically a light tone against a dark tone. The trunk is a dark tone against a light tone. So it's, you know, it's seeing in painterly mindset rather than, you know, just as a subject. So now I'm going to come in with my burnt sienna.
And before you get to that, what blue were you using previously? Was it phthalo blue or manganese? Someone wanted to know.
Yeah, it's Prussian. So like phthalo,
Prussian.
but Prussian. Yeah. And now I'm deepening up. Now this is effectively my red, this burnt sienna, but I'm also going to use violet. And so where the trunk is very dark, so my blue and my yellow, that's my two primaries there. But now my red is, because there's no red in this, but except that there is in grey, my red is both burnt sienna, which is the warmer of the two, and then violet, because I want to make really nice deep darks. And those two lovely transparent colours with the Prussian blue, look, make it gorgeous, like jet black. And there's just the three colours there mixing together to make a nice jet black. So now I'm just looking at the real darks there. And I don't want to go too black too quick, only for that trunk there, because I want to keep my three colours so that there's warmth and trade-off between them. Watercolor is a medium where basically the less colors you use, the more colorful your painting is likely to be, because the transparency of the colors mean that the reaction between colors is much more apparent on the paper, to the eye, to the brain. So I'm dropping in now this burnt sienna, which is darkening up the tone and warming up the hue. Come to that little tail later, I think. And wet into wet, it all comes together quite quickly. So basically, it's always it's almost a surprise to me how fast something can be painted in wet in wet, because the wet in wet does all this lovely mid-tone blends. Now we're bringing the violet in. So they're starting to get darker. Now I don't like the way that the little end of the trunk there has gone sort of upsy-diddle with the water. So I'm just going to clean my water there and push. I mentioned before about pushing colour back. I don't like to dab. I like to push colour back. So I like to use my brush. Oh, I've just dropped my brush. So I'm pushing the colour back with the brush, back into the place where I want it to be. Got an aberrant hair here. All this can go back in. That was the wet from the... But don't dab. If you dab, then all these lovely little particles that are sitting here trying to be nice and random on the paper. So this hair that's determined to... It'll have to come off when it's dry. Like what's on my brush there? Some violet. Let's come back into our trunk.
And one of our members wants to know if you have any hints for improving one's drawing skills.
Practice, 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 practice. Basically, drawing for watercolor isn't the same as drawing for other things, though, because drawing for watercolor is really just giving a guide to the brush. And it basically, again, it should be minimums, because you only need to tell the brush where it can and cannot go. That's all you need to be telling it. Sorry, I got another hair there. Ugh, don't know why I've got so many hairs today. There, I've got that one. So basically, it is helpful to be able to draw for a watercolorist, because you want to be able to get something down quickly. But really, the brush draws with area, whereas the pencil draws with line. And so the two are kind of, they're sort of different art forms. So really, you only need to be able to draw enough to avoid the lights. In other words, to tell your brush where it cannot go, rather than detail, because it's the brush that does the detail, and it's done with area rather than line. So yeah, I mean, yeah, drawing practice is, yeah, I mean,
That was great. That was a great answer. Yeah.
you're very kind. You always say my answers are great.
They are great. And one of our members wants to know what the brand is of your folding palette.
It's a schmink. It's a schmink palette. Most of my colors are schminker, and most of my yes, sorry, yeah, that's the answers to that. Sorry, yeah.
Right. And what was that violet you were using again?
This is called Schminker Violet, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. And what I'm trying to do here now is I am putting the violet into the areas. Basically, I've got these 4 colors now, haven't I? Mingling together on the paper, creating mixing to gradually create a grey. I'm not actually looking for a dull grey. I'm looking for a colourful grey. So I'm not looking for it to sort of mimic the photograph. I'm looking for it to, I'm using the, the photograph to get myself warmth and coolness. But I am looking for them to blend to the extent that they are not only seen on their own in one or two places, so that they, in everywhere else, they have started to come together. And now I'm coming in with my deep dark black color for my real darks.
And one of our members knows about the sizes of your brushes, but what brand do you actually use?
These are actually made by the SAA, which is an English company that used to make my videos. And so I was desperate that people would be able to have decent sable brushes. And so they made a set very inexpensively. I think it was done through the Winsor & Newton factories. Now I notice on screen this actually looks more pinky than it does on my paper. My paper, it looks a bit more browny, but I can see that at least on my screen it looks a bit more pinky than it actually is. So it looks a bit brighter on the screen, whereas it's a bit more muted in practice on the paper here. But I'm not sure what I can do about that, because it'd be difficult to make it match to the screen. But
Well, on my screen, it just looks beautiful.
I suppose everybody's screens are probably set differently, so actually that's probably
true.
Yeah, they're probably, everybody's seeing it slightly different coloring. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that actually, because it's not but you see how I'm trying to get as much done in while it's wet, because basically that gives me the most happening in this single layer. Once it dries, then I let it dry, and then I re-wet if I want it soft, or I go hard edge. But I try to get it done within the first sort of layer, because then I know I'm guaranteed maximum freshness. Now I've probably wetted that too early, and you'll probably see a bit of blooming there, because my color was a bit too wet here, and so you can see it starting to bloom out into that edge there. So I can slightly retrieve it by putting more pigment in here to suck that back, but I don't mess with it. I just forgive myself because things go wrong. I'm losing light a bit here. It's getting a bit dark in this here. It looks all right on the screen, but actually I'm getting quite dark in my studio. So I'm just going to put some light on, if that's all right. Let's kind of alter it a bit, but oh, that's going to be too bright. Okay, so let me just do it. Is that okay still? It's just that
it looks fine. It looks great.
Because I was beginning to not be able to see what I was painting. And the trouble is, the videos, they look bright, don't they? They look clean and bright long after the light's gone. Right, I want some space on my palette for cleaner paint, because all those were dark.
And so you've used 4 colors on this one, the raw sienna, the Prussian, and the...
It was yellow ochre. It was yellow ochre, actually, rather.
yellow ochre, okay.
And then, as you say, the Prussian and the burnt sienna. Burnt sienna and yellow ochre are the same family. They're both earth colors. So although they're two separate hues, they're the same pigment. So you're always safe using as many earths as you want, really, because they're not going to dull. And one of the things we'll talk about in the workshop is, basically the reason you don't have too many colors is because you don't want to dull your mixes, because basically what happens is that pigment mixing tends to darkness. That's what it does, as we can see from the earth. When earth composted, all the colors of the flowers, the trees and everything mixed together, and they make brown and then eventually black like oil. So that's the result of pigment mixing. So what we have to do, because we are trying to retain light, is we have to try and avoid having too many colors. Now you see there, I dropped a rather wet color in, so I got a bloom there. But again, I don't get cross with myself. I say, okay, right, well, let's put some more color in, because I let those, all those things, so long as your tones are correct at the end of the day, the blue, all the things that you might think are aberrations in a watercolor often don't turn out to be. It's like trusting this medium to do, to do it, because it's such a beautiful medium. It's such a beautiful medium. Now here's not dry enough to go in with the dark there, but I'd like to darken that a bit. Let's come down and make this lovely. Oh, I don't want that color there. Let's just tint the ground. Now these are all staining colors. So here, where I'd like to push this foot back a bit, I won't be able to get much color off. Can you see the stain of the Prussian blue? I can remove the burnt sienna because that is a lifting color, but the Prussian blue and the violet are staining colors. So you can see there I've managed to lift the burnt sienna because I want to get back the feeling of the dust over the hoof, over the foot. And so let's now paint our, well, that's my little list of the colors I was going to use at the bottom, so I'll rub that out.
Hazel, one of our members wants to know if the paper dries sooner than you would like it to. Do you spray your painting, or what do you do to get it as wet as you want it to be?
In general, I don't spray, but it's not because I wouldn't spray. It's because I just try to carry as few things around as possible, so I don't have a spray with me when I'm out. So basically, I just re-wet with a brush is what I do, and it often happens. Basically it is going to happen that the paper is going to dry faster than than I can paint, and so often I'm having to re-wet. In this instant, because I'm painting like I paint in Africa in my studio in London, it's actually not drying quite fast enough for me. Hence, yeah. And I'm kind of working on the assumption that it's going to dry like I would expect. And of course it isn't, because it's cooler here and damper here than obviously it is in Africa. So interesting, all these factors have to be taken into account, when you're painting. Now what am I wanting? I want to tint that front here. Some of this is drying now, which is handy because I want tints to go across the nose area here. Now here, I can't soften the Prussian because it's a staining color. Going to try to, but you can't, because look, it's a staining color. There's no way. If that was Prussian, if that was something like ultramarine blue, then you would be able to. So I will just tint that with first of all, for me, it looks bluish. It does look bluish. I'll tint it with some more of the blue. Because it's now drying, so now I can put tints and bring here over the under the side of the face here. I want to deepen and darken that a bit. Let me show you my reference again so you can see where I'm getting my information from. So do you see, I see all the underside here is the darker side, and I'm trying to keep the light on the top. And again, I don't want to get too detailed because I'm trying to show you how I would paint from life. Obviously, if an elephant's moving like this, then you're not going to be able to paint that kind of shape from life. Tends to be when they're walking a bit more sedately, because obviously the that movement is quite a quick movement, so the chances of catching it exactly would be harder.
So I just want to know, how close are you to these elephants?
Oh, very close, because if you're in a vehicle, then you're very close. And if you're, this one actually was from a lodge and I'm on a deck just above it. So very close. Yeah. But I mean, in the Kalahari, the animals, there's no elephants in the Kalahari because it's far too dry. But in the Kalahari, the animals are right, you can paint, you're right beside them. You can paint right beside the springbok, and in a vehicle, you don't get out of your vehicle because there are predators, obviously. And these animals are very used to vehicles and know that they're safe. And so, they're very relaxed, and bizarrely, sort of, to some extent, ostrich and springbok and Hemsbok, they kind of pose for you. It's quite extraordinary. People are always amazed. They say, oh, now I see why you do it. They suddenly realize I'm not quite so clever as they thought.
I don't know. I think you're pretty brave too. A brave artist.
Well, I mean, I don't know, those people who, if you go to Africa, it's the most wonderful, it gets into your blood, and it's very hard to not return once you've been to Africa, I think. It becomes part of you. Just a little hint of some of this detail in the trunk, but not much, because again, it's not what you can see. The trouble, I think, one of the problems with working from photographs, which obviously one has to a large extent with wildlife and with lots of other subjects, is that you think you can see things that you can't normally see with your own eye. And so I always try to paint when I'm painting in the studio the same way as I paint from life, i.e. what I would notice immediately with the eye and not include that which I wouldn't. So it's very easy when you have photographic reference to keep on going and to keep finding detail that is really superfluous, because once you've got the tones right, basically, that is your composition, that is your subject, especially with animals, and you want to keep the life in them. So that's still not dry. See that there? And again, I've added, and look, it's seeped out. So it's quite interesting how wet, and that I expected that. I thought that would be dry when I touched that with the brush. So it just shows you how, even though I paint all the time, I can't guess evaporation rates. You can only, do it by touching your paint. So I'm just going to add in a bit more pigment there to pick up. But I don't mind, I'm quite happy if I'm very, very always let my paint do its thing. I try not to dictate terms too much, and I find that, you know, I get more magic out of the watercolor by not telling it exactly where to go and not telling it off if it doesn't go where I want it to go. So I'm dropping in the three of the colors here, not the blue here for this dust. I'm not bringing down the background behind the elephant here, so my dust needs to be darker than the elephant, rather than lighter in that case, or not darker than the elephant, but darker than the background. I think it might be, how's the time? I think there might be time for me to do another demonstration. Because, what time have we got to finish?
Well, I'll be here as long as you want to be. Let me see. What time will we? All right, I'll get right back with you. Hang on a sec.
I completely lost track of time. I've just been, you know, happily painting away and completely lost track of time. So I don't know. Can't even, I suppose I could look on my computer. Oh, it's nearly 8:30 for me, but that's not for you.
Yeah, we did say 90 minutes. So we are approaching.
Oh, we are approaching. Yes. Okay. Well, I'm happy to go, you know, I'm happy to go on, but I'm not happy with this bit here of the painting, though. Don't like what's happened there because it doesn't feel like dust. And so I'm going to scrub it around. Now, the other thing, if I don't like what's happened and it's staining colors, clean water and a sponge. This piece of paper is also Saunders Waterford, and it is 300 pounds, so it's heavier. And because of that, it's very easy to be, you know, quite robust. So if I really don't like something, I'll come in with a sponge and lift it out as much as I possibly can to
and what kind of sponge is that? Is that the white Mr. Clean sponge? Oh.
No, this is a natural sponge. Again, it's because basically I don't carry a lot of stuff around with me, so I kind of tend to have less in the studio. I have, I suppose I end up with the same things in the studio as outside, but because I use these for sponging and making texture, I use the same sponge for rubbing out, but it does mean that they wear out very quickly and I have to get more. I'm very much I am a person of minimums. Like everybody, I love to have loads of colors and loads of different things, but in practice, you know, you can only paint with a certain number of colors on an everyday basis, because if you're going to paint outside. And so then when I come back in the studio, I tend to paint in a similar manner because they're usually things that I have seen outside that I then want to turn into painting. So I end up in a way painting very similar inside to how I paint outside, really. And you know, I love to experiment with different colors, and I do, but I almost always end up back with my set of colors. I'm trying at the moment to experiment. Obviously, I adore cadmium red, but cadmium, as we all know, is, you know, quite toxic. And there's probably going to come a time when it's already banned in some places. I'm trying to find a replacement for it. At the minute, I can't find a replacement because there is none that's as vibrant and gives us much brighter color. There's hues that are similar, but they're not opaque in the same way, or they're not lifting in the same way. And this is the kind of thing that we will be covering, you know, on this 2-day workshop, is, you know, the properties of colors. If you know the properties, then you know when you can use them. And basically, it makes lots of sense as to why something works or doesn't work, once you understand that the properties of colors are so important. We haven't, touched hugely on it in this demo, except to talk about transparency and staining. But it's, it's so exciting. It's so interesting.
So for the workshop, one of the members wants to know if we need to have the 300-pound paper.
No, no. The paper I was using for this one is ordinary 140-pound, and basically, if you tape down onto a board, then any buckling that you get, you can, it will flatten out again afterwards. Really, the reason I've used the heavy paper, I use it really when I think something's going to buckle because I'm using a lot of water and I haven't got time to stick it down, or it isn't practical. In this instance, it was basically paper I had that fitted the size perfectly under the screen. But it doesn't have to be, this is 140-pound, and that's just as good. But just tape it down if we're doing something that goes to the edges, because basically if it goes to the edges and it's wet, then it will cause the paper to buckle.
Okay. So the heavier weight paper is not important for your wet into wet. You use all types of paper.
Yeah, yes. The roughness is, though, because the roughness means that you get a little bit longer drying time because of the indentations in the paper from a rougher tooth. And so that's why a rough paper can be really useful for wet and wet. Not as fine as well, but hot pressed wouldn't work. Hot pressed, you would get lots of blooms like this, because hot pressed, there's no, the texture isn't in the paper, it's on the surface. And so it deliberately wants to get those kind of blooms and blobs. So that there's 3 types of paper: hot pressed, cold pressed, or not is the other name for cold pressed, and then rough.
Okay. And we do, I don't know if we have it on the website yet, but we will have your supply list on our website.
Yes, I think you have it already.
I know you've sent it to us, but I
yeah.
haven't checked on the website. Yeah.
And the paper, cotton, what I should have said, and I didn't say, is more important than anything, is cotton paper, ideally, because cotton paper enables you to create more, what's the word, more blends that, smoother blends is the word I'm trying to look at, smoother blends. Whereas if you use wood chip paper, which is things like Bockingford, that's harder to make blends. So your paper will always tell you if it's 100% cotton. If it doesn't tell you it's 100% cotton, it isn't.
Oh.
So it will say, if it's 100% cotton, it will always say on the pad. Because basically it's cheaper to make paper out of wood chip. Now
Yeah.
I was hoping this would dry so I could just show you how, when it's dry, I can do tints across, but it's not drying. It's still damp. And I think the very damp weather is, it's probably going to be damp for a while. But the other thing I must show you, even though I can't, maybe won't be able to do that tint over it, is the other thing I love to do with watercolor, and lots of artists do it, is this thing of making splashes and splodges, because it's such fun to let the paint, again, be random, in things like, in other words, it just gives it a bit of life to a painting, and it makes it look like the elephants, just kicking up a little bit of dust in this instance. Just loading the brush. And I have a hairdryer in my studio here, but and let me just answer that. I hardly ever use a hairdryer, but I wouldn't say I don't, because basically if for something is really, for example, here, I would be tempted to dry it with a hairdryer, but the problem is you then means other areas might dry that I don't really want to dry quite yet, because what happens when you dry it is you stop it flowing. And so by desire and by design, I try not to use a hairdryer, and so I hardly ever do, but that doesn't mean I don't use any aid to help me. I'm a great believer. You make things, this is, make no mistake, this medium is a hard medium. It is the hardest of the painting media. So therefore you do anything you can to make it easier. So if a hairdryer means you can dry a surface and then put that tint across and get it all, then use it. Likewise with masking fluid, I use masking fluid in the studio. I can't use it out in the bush because it wouldn't dry fast enough. I do anything to make my life easier because it's also hard, but I do, the more years I paint, the more I trust the medium to know what it's doing rather than me, if that makes any sense. Wet in wet gives you, it's really hard to be random, isn't it? And, you know, if we try and do lots of random dots, it's really hard. And what wet in wet does is it allows the pigment particles to move randomly rather than be pushed into position. So in something like oils, you have to manipulate the oil to make the blends. But with wet in wet, and with the beauty of a medium that literally floats on the paper, is that you get randomness by default. And I think that that is what is so lovely about the wet and wet technique, is that it looks like it's organic, because it is organic. And it's the same thing as doing splotches and splatters. You know, we all like splotches and splatters because they are organic, they are random. And we tend to order, and in painting, the more we move away and let the brush do the work, and the more we let flicks and flacks and all that kind of thing do the stuff, the more wonderful it all looks, doesn't it?
Well, thank you so much, Hazel, and we'll see you in June, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to it. I can't wait. And, you know, basically, ask me anything. I just love talking about watercolor. I just love doing it and talking about it.
Well, you do and if y'all have not got her books, they are just fabulous. And what she does with her colors are just amazing. So go online, grab a book. And I'm going to I didn't know we could already pre-order the new one you have coming out on figures.
Well, and although it's not coming out till this week, I've got an advanced copy here to show people. So that's what it's like. Yeah.
Oh, that is
this is both oils and watercolor, actually, because my publishers, you know, wanted something that covered everything, but basically